and relieved. And I'm going to hand over now to Joy, who is going to introduce Laura, our second speaker of the day. Over to you, Joy.
It's a huge pleasure that Laura has come to speak to us today. She was born and raised in Wisconsin, lived in Canada, and her first contact with the George Eliot Fellowship was for her friend's birthday to buy a brick for the George Eliot Visitors Day. Anyway, she decided to come to London and has been living in England for 5 years. And 2 years ago, joined us here for the study day, at which time we discovered that she had chosen to live in Highgate, just down the road from the cemetery. And since then, she's become a wonderful volunteer with George Eliot and George Henry Lewis's graves. She's had a wonderful pot of flowers all through the summer on George Henry Lewis's grave, which is absolutely great. Her interests are eclectic. Her work involves computer science research. She writes and has huge knowledge and interest in English literature, particularly George Eliot. She keeps teaching me all sorts of things. And recently she has been researching George Eliot's process as she prepared to write Deronda, and she's going to tell us all about it.
I was excited but nervous when Joy suggested that I could.
You speak up.
Yes, that's good. Okay. I was excited but nervous when Joy suggested that I could do this because in many ways I'm an odd person to be presenting here. I'm not British, I'm not Jewish, I don't have a literature degree, I'm a computer scientist by training. I'm just an enthusiast, but I took comfort in quotes like this one, which we've seen before. Yes. We've all seen quotes where George Eliot's talking about her purposes in writing literature, and it's about she's writing for people, not for historians or critics. She wants individual people doing their own moral and emotional homework to have their sympathies expanded by what she's doing, and for her purposes, what I think does matter, and what all of you think does matter, and it's yeah. I think beginning the discussion of Deronda in particular, it's worth looking at the full source of this quote in this letter to Charles Gray. I can't tell you how much melancholy it causes me that people are, for the most part, so incapable of comprehending the state of mind which cares for that which is essentially human in all forms of belief and desires to exhibit it under all forms with loving truthfulness. Freethinkers are scarcely wider than the orthodox in this matter. They all want to see themselves and their own opinions held up as the true and beloved. On the same ground that an idle woman with quotations and flounces likes to read a French novel because she can imagine herself a heroine, brave people with opinions like the most admirable character in a novel to be their mouthpiece. If art does not enlarge men's sympathies, it does nothing morally. I have had hard-cutting experience that opinions are floor cement between human souls. The only effect I ardently long to produce by my writings is that those who read them should be better able to imagine and to feel the pains and the joys of those who differ from themselves in everything but the broad fact of being struggling, erring human creatures. And that allusion there to the idle woman reading the French novel where she can see herself as the heroine, there's lots that can be said about the interplay between the two parts of Deronda, the Gwendolyn half and the Daniel half, but if you gave me 20 seconds to make the one strongest case I could, it would be if you're trying to tell a story about the moral education of a young woman who goes from being self-centered to learning the world is bigger than her, telling that story in a novel that's just about her, keeps the story in the universe of the novel just about her, and telling it in a book that has this other half that's not about her, it's about things in places she has no real connection to or knowledge of. It humbles the character in our eyes more, it shows what place in the universe better. So we know and love George Eliot for having this goal of expanding our sympathies, of helping us sympathize with people outside of our own social orbits. That's occurred in a lot of her novels. Is what she she's writing Deronda in the early 1970s. She's at the peak of her post-Middlemarch fame. She's rich. She doesn't need the money. She could do whatever she wants. And the group she chooses to focus that desire to expand human sympathies on is the Jews. And that's a really specific and interesting choice. And so what we're going to look at is why she made that choice and how she executed on it in the particular way that she did. What I found trying to talk to friends about this is that it helps to start with about 10 to 20 sentences of sort of basic Jewish history to get everyone on the same page before we head into the Victorian era. Yeah. Yes, oh gosh, I'm sorry.
And slow down.
Okay. That's very Eliot people. So, if this is one direction. Okay. So, 2,000 years ago, there are a lot of different communities in Mesopotamia, herding animals, speaking Semitic languages, with different, sometimes overlapping ideas about God, being somehow connected with nature, somehow connected with places. At some point, one group seems to develop an idea of God that's a bit more of a covenant relationship, and more specific to their group. If we take the Bible literally, then Abraham starts out in Ur and finds then they move towards Canaan with the detour by Egypt due to famine and then slavery. It's really hard to establish things historically this far in the past. The Bible gives a really swift, decisive, sort of conquering narrative where the Israelites show up in Canaan and take it, and there's not archaeological support for that. It's probably more likely they just sort of moved their community flourished in some way. What the first reference to Israel is on a monument in Egypt in 12,000 BC. So that's the first time we know there's some community in what we now think of as Israel called by that name and known by its neighbors. And they're there for a while until the Babylonian Empire rises in about 600 BC, and this is Nebuchadnezzar, and they exiled the Jewish elite from Judea, not the whole population, just the elite. They make a move to Babylon to prevent the population from sort of developing politically, but most of the Jewish people, most rural and educated people get to stay. Less than 100 years later, Babylon is conquered by Persia. Cyrus has an edict saying the Jews can go back, so they do in a few ways migrate back from Babylon to Judea, although some of them stay, and they stay in Babylon, some of them. And then the empires rise and fall, the Jews basically stay in Judea until the Roman Empire in the first century AD, the Jews revolt against Rome, they lose, and there's a second exile, and this time the whole population goes a much more thorough kind of clearing out. And they move all kinds of different places. And they bounce around a lot depending on where conditions are. Where conditions are here. So people have tried to put together maps of where the different exploding edicts in different places happened. What will concern us is in England the 1290 number. And that's Edward I, who wants to raise money to go fight against France, and so he expels the Jews and seizes their property, and then also the nobles don't have to pay back their debts to the others. And the Jews are informally welcomed back under Cromwell the Jews are sort of informally allowed back into England under Cromwell in the 1650s. He's seen that they're doing well in Amsterdam and thinks this might be good economically. There's an attempt to get them to naturalize them in 1753, which gets immediately repealed because of public outcry. And then after the French Revolution, we see lots of different European countries start to grant more rights to different groups than previously were in. That includes England and the Jews. So UCL is founded in London, is founded specifically to have a mission without reference to religion. So they're the first to admit Jewish students to university in the 1820s. I mentioned universities here because Daniel Deronda goes to Cambridge in what seems to be about the 1860s. And it's like, I was asking him, I don't understand the English university system. well enough to be sure exactly how the status of the Jewish students there changed from the Oxford and Cambridge University Acts into the university's test acts. The test acts is definitely when you're to get a fellowship, you no longer have to swear on the basis of your Christian faith. But I think he could have graduated with the BA. And the point being, Hugo Mellinger sends Daniel Deronda to Cambridge, knowing that he's Jewish. Daniel doesn't know, but Hugo, who went to Cambridge, does know. And thinking of Daniel at Cambridge, potentially, not knowing he's Jewish, but if he had been Jewish, potentially unable to do some things, or only recently have gained the right to do some things. That's that's an interesting kind of flavor to have in mind. That's not clear from the text of the book itself. In the end, then in 1858, Jews are allowed to become MPs if they're openly Jewish. So Disraeli, I think, becomes an MP in the 1830s, but he's been baptized as a Christian, and the deal he strikes with Parliament to be admitted is that he does swear the oath on the basis of Christian faith. So that's at times when Hugo Mellinger is giving Daniel Deronda career advice and talks about becoming a politician, and that would only read like that's in Daniel's childhood. That's a possibility only because he's being raised not as a Jew, and in his adulthood would have just become possible to do as a Jew. I think I'll.
Can I just mention about Cromwell?
Yeah.
He was very, very keen to get the Jewish community back,
Yeah.
but he had to get that through Parliament. And before he could do that, he actually granted trading charters in the West Indies. And so there was a community of Barbados that predates that, which is amazing. And that was his way of getting around it. But of course, there were a lot of Sephardi Jews in London, undercover, as it were, not kind of formally there, but they were actually there too, So it was kind of a formality to kind of make them welcome back into the country.
I mean, you do get immigration from the Dutch community into the Jewish community after.
Yes, there was. In fact, there was a delegation from Amsterdam.
Yeah. We're going to see a picture of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam in a few slides.
Laura, can I just ask you, because it's very interesting in terms of Daniel Deronda and the point you just made about Daniel going to Cambridge, because of course, and he doesn't know, as you said. Do you think that could be why in the narrative George Eliot decides that actually, because of course she doesn't totally decide, that Daniel will leave Cambridge? He gives up his studies, so it never comes to the point of him commuting or finishing.
Yeah, that's possible that she was trying to
She was kind of negotiating around the fact that,
I think it's really interesting the reaction that Daniel's saying he wants to leave Cambridge triggers in Hugo Mellinger, which is to say, so you don't want to be an Englishman to the backbone then. You don't want to be an Englishman through and through. Like which is not a pop.
Yeah, but you're right. But it's interesting the way that's balanced in the novel by Hans's intervention, because Hans's intervention writing to Sir Hugo to emphasise the goodness of Daniel Deronda, the selflessness of him, as to why he's giving up his studies, from the reader's point of view, balances out, I think, Sir Hugo's sort of comments and so on. So we're supportive of that. I just find this really very interesting, the idea that obviously George Eliot knows he's Jewish in her writing, but we as the readers, and Daniel himself doesn't know, so she sends it. But of course, so his father does know, but he's brought up as, not his father, but Hugo knows, but he's bringing him up as an Englishman, which is the commitment he made to Daniel's mother, to deny his Jewishness. So in fact, in some ways, as Hugo to send him to Cambridge and to do that is his fulfilling or seeking to fulfill the promise he made to Daniel's mother.
Absolutely.
The dates are really interesting. Yeah.
I think probably the most surprising date on this slide is Daniel Deronda being published in 1876 because of how early it is. So I just told you a kind of hopeful story where the Jews are now starting to get more rights in many European countries, including England. Now they can be in Parliament, now they can be in universities. And this is the moment when she writes about that Pamela alluded to Mordecai's intense vision that he really wants to communicate to Daniel before he dies, and it's his view of the future of Judaism is that there should be some kind of polity reestablished in Palestine, some kind of national center. And this is at a time when Jews in Europe are feeling more hopeful about their Korean status. That's a really interesting time to write that. This is a graph where you can see Jewish immigration into Palestine on top of the populations that were already there. It's hard to get great records going back further than 1872 because of Ottoman Empire, census data. But if she's writing 1876, and you start seeing much bigger jumps a couple decades later, and this is because of pogroms in Russia in 1881, 1882, and that's what's really significant about those pogroms isn't just that they happen. It's not just that Cossacks show up and desperate communities. It's that the government doesn't react, doesn't get involved, doesn't. So there's no kind of military or police presence showing up to maintain law and order. They're allowed to just do whatever they want as long as they want. This is what's really scary and triggers this feeling of we need to get out. And I think it was interesting to me looking through some of the stuff to realize at this point there's no refugee status under international law. There's really no there's nothing to stop a country from doing to people inside its borders whatever it wants. Even if the German trials after World War II, Hitler isn't, the Nazis aren't tried for what they did to German Jews. They're tried for what they did to Jews in Poland and other countries once they got outside of Germany's borders. So there's no sort of international legal framework at this point to stop a country from doing things to its own people. So that's the 1880s. You get this, much more interested moving to Israel out of Russia. You also get movement from Jews into London for the same reason. And one of the last dates I put here, the Aliens Act of 1905 is to prevent that. You've had a big, since the 1880s, a lot of Jews fleeing Russia coming into London, and they're poor and uneducated, and England wants to suppress this here.
Cambridge, George Eliot was a sponsor, benefactor of Girton College, which was the First Ladies' College there.
Yeah.
And she did upset the principal once when she turned up unannounced and just walked to the college and chatted to the undergraduates. So I just thought it was a nice thing to maybe that's why Cambridge is, not Oxford, but Cambridge is in the novel, Yeah.
It's interesting on that graph how in 1945, 1948, there were more Jewish folk who got to, the Holocaust, once the war had been won, I guess they got out the message from those awful concentration camps. They probably thought, enough, this is what Europe does to us, let's go,
Yeah, I mean, so some of it is fear, some of it is not all countries after World War II were willing to make arrangements to bring their former. There's a lot of logistic complication there. Even if you wanted to go back, it might be hard. There's waves of similar after the Babylonian exile, when just the elites had to leave Judea to go to Babylon. Once they're allowed back, there's several waves of return. They don't all just come at once. There's three waves, and similarly with Jewish immigration into Palestine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you get three waves. This isn't obviously George Eliot didn't know about that. And I spoke this talk to look at her research process, what she was trying to achieve up to the book, really. But I think, she and George Lewis thought about going to Palestine, and they thought about going to America in the 1850s, and didn't concluded from their health that they shouldn't. I haven't found evidence that George Eliot ever met a Muslim person. They spent time in Spain and the areas that had been worried, and they read a lot about the architecture, and she admired various Sufi and Arab poets, that she'd read their books, but and there's a moment when Mordecai is in the bar. There's a scene in the book where Mordecai brings Daniel to a pub to talk to his sort of philosopher club, and Mordecai's really pitching his vision in sort of pretty flowery language, and he draws a comparison to it's going to be like creating a new polity, new republic in North America, and how great that went. And there's without the kind of awareness of indigenous peoples that you would of course need to have today. There's a blind spot for him in that conversation that I think George Eliot has about the light gray bars here, the people already living in Palestine. Mordecai's vision says that it should be a republic, it should be equal. It's in vague terms, but she's not thinking clearly about that. So being, I was saying, 1876 is a sort of strangely early time to be thinking in terms of a return to Israel. Like most Jewish leaders aren't thinking that way. In the same discussion in the pub, there's a moment where the character Mordecai is selling his vision, and the character named Ash says, "Well, that's never going to happen until you get some professors and some people on the exchange on board with this." And in a way, he's right, because after the programs in the 1800s, that is when the Rothschilds specifically started funding missions to Palestine to help Jews get out of Russia and get to Palestine, which they were not doing before the 1800s. So Mordecai talks about having I went to many of our people, to the rich in influence or knowledge, to the rich in other wealth, but I found none to listen with understanding. I was rebuked for error, I was offered a small sum in charity. No wonder. I looked poor, I carried a bundle of the Hebrew manuscript with me. I said, our teachers are misleading the hope of our race. Scholars and merchants were both too busy to listen. Scorn stood as interpreter between me and them. And in the 1870s, the reaction is not until after the programs that you get the Jewish elite buying into trying to make something. I have disoriented myself slightly. Yes, okay. And then eventually, in 1917, the Balfour Declarations, the British government agreed to help support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, and because Britain gets the mandate to handle Palestine after the Ottoman Empire dissolves, they're in a position of real authority there, which they take a while to execute, and that's all beyond scope of this talk. The point is, she's writing, she's choosing to interpret Judaism in a way that introduces a return to Israel weirdly early, before many Jews themselves are thinking that way, and we're going to look at why did she end up with that view of Judaism. But before we do that, another piece of context that seems to help is that another date that we could add to this slide is in a date I could have put here but I didn't, is that in 1860 Charles Dickens sells his house, and this if you know the Bloomsbury area of London, this is Tavistock. This is where the British Medical Association is today. There's a blue plaque saying Charles Dickens once had a house near here. That house. He decides to sell it, and he sells it to a Jew. He sells it to James Phineas Davis. And when he is selling it, he's writing letters to his friends saying, I'm selling my house to a Jewish money lender. If he decides to buy it, I'm not taking anything for certain until I've actually gotten the money. I wonder how the neighbors will feel about living next to Israelites. But then the transaction goes really well. He says it was just the cleanest, easiest transaction of its kind that I've ever had. And then James Davis's wife, this is Eliza Davis, and seemingly emboldened by how well that went, she writes Dickens a letter asking for a donation to a Jewish charity, and also telling him off for Fagin and Oliver Twist, which they have a really fascinating exchange of letters that we're not going to go into too deeply because this is a George Eliot fellowship. But I think the George Eliot fellowship likes to throw some shade on Dickens, so but she's telling this is in Oliver Twist, there's this very unpleasant thief character named Fagin who's not only Jewish but just really gratuitously over and over again described as Fagin the Jew, introduced with that, and there's a lot of unpleasantness. She writes to Dickens telling him this is bad, and he writes back and says, One, I've got nothing against the Jews. This is not a religion thing, it's a race thing, and just unfortunately it was a fact at that time that the people receiving, Solenka's word invariably uses the word invariably Jewish, and gives her a donation to charity. And she writes back, and then that's not good enough. No, yes, there are Christians receiving Solenkas as well as Jews, and it's really important when someone in your kind of position is spreading this stuff. This is really damaging. And eventually he apologizes and he edits further into like the future editions of Oliver Twist to be a bit softer in the language around Fagin. And then when he writes Our Mutual Friend, which I haven't read, but apparently in Our Mutual Friend there's a character named John's our tickets expert, he's not like, there's a character named Mr. Rhea who is Jewish and very nice. He's Jewish and very nice, but that's about the best you can say. I mean, that Dickens wrote a nice character and labeled him as Jewish. He makes some kind of clumsy errors. He has him, talk about Jehovah God, and Eliza Davis is, that's not something that you would ever say. You don't pronounce the tetragrammatic name of God out loud ever. It's a, so it's a nice gesture. It's not research. She does the whole thing by sending him a really pretty Hebrew English Bible with a note saying it's a really important virtue, or really eminent virtue, as soon as you've been shown that you're wrong to admit it and correct it, and it's great that you did that. So it sounds Catholic, but even Dickens' happy ending of being shown that he's wrong and kind of clumsily trying to fix it is such a far cry from what George Eliot does in trying to touch the same topic. We're going to see her go through a decade of research to get really minute details right to a point where rabbis are writing her thank you letters, and it's the contrast between the two of them here is really high. But it's worth pointing out that George Eliot herself didn't start out where she was at the time she wrote Deronda. She started out with prejudices that were more like Dickens's. And there's a quote that often gets read. Like if we all pulled out our copies of Daniel Deronda and looked at the introductions, I think a lot of them would probably have some version of this quote from when she's in her 20s. My Gentile nature kicks most resolutely against any assumption of superiority in the Jews, and is almost ready to echo Voltaire's vituperation. I bow to the supremacy of Hebrew poetry, but much of their early mythology, and almost all of their history, is utterly revolting. Their stock has produced a Moses and a Jesus, but Moses was impregnated with Egyptian philosophy, and Jesus is venerated and adored by us only for that wherein he transcended or resisted Judaism. The very exaltation of their idea of a national deity into a spiritual monotheism seems to have been borrowed from the other Oriental tribes. Everything specifically Jewish is of a low grade. So that passage is pretty commonly quoted. I was pretty shocked to discover this is the autobiography of her life that John Cross stitched together out of her letters after she died. This is published by William Blackwood and Sons. This is a proper copy. And when I went back to trace that quote to the version that he included, it's a much longer letter, and the worst parts are worse than that. If anyone wants to look at that afterwards, I've got the book here, but it's even that isn't it's hard to read. It's hard to think that she felt that way. But she grows a lot from that point. So this is 1848 when I quoted, and then 10 years later, by the time she's writing to Francois de Vergerade, who I first learned about at my first George Eliot study maybe 2 years ago, as a painter in Geneva that she went to stay with after her father died. The context of his letter is that he's just read Adam Bede, and he's saying, wow, this doesn't sound like where you were at on some topics 10 years ago. And she's saying, yeah, I have evolved. I think I hardly ever spoke to you of the strong hold evangelical Christianity had on me from the age of 15 to 2 and 20, and of the abundant intercourse I had had with earnest people of various religious sects. When I was at Geneva, I had not yet lost the attitude of antagonism which belongs to the renunciation of any belief. Also, I was very unhappy, and in a state of discord and rebellion towards my own lot. 10 years of experience have wrought great changes in that inward self. I have no longer any antagonism towards any faith in which human sorrow and human longing for purity have expressed themselves. On the contrary, I have sympathy with it that predominates over all argumentative tendencies. I have not returned to dogmatic Christianity, to the acceptance of any set of doctrines as a creed, and a superhuman revelation of the unseen. But I see in it the highest expression of the religious sentiment that has yet found its place in the history of mankind, and I have the profoundest interest in the inward life of sincere Christians in all ages. So she's gone from being very evangelical to being, pretty non-religious to being softening on Christian forms of religion. And then how does she get from here to feeling similarly warmly about Judaism? Continuing to quote, many things that I should have argued against 10 years ago, I now feel myself too ignorant and too limited in moral sensibility to speak of with confident disapprobation. On many points where I used to delight in expressing intellectual difference, I now delight in feeling an emotional agreement. On that question of our future existence, to which you allude, I have undergone the sort of change I have just indicated, although my most rooted conviction is that the immediate object in the proper sphere of all our highest emotions are our struggling fellow men and this earthly existence. So, she's softening Christianity in general. The journey towards Judaism, part of it happens by accident. So she in 1860, she and George Henry Lewis are traveling through Italy. And when they, I guess I'll let you read that one for yourself. When they leave Genoa and heading towards Leghorn, they have some time to kill unexpectedly while they're traveling, and their coachman just suggests maybe they'd like to check out the synagogue, and so they just happen to stop in, and they Livorno is if you're going to just happen upon a synagogue, this is a really, really nice one. This is and it was destroyed in the war, but it was built in the 1600s, and we've got this is painting done in the 1850s of a service going on there, holiday service. This is what the outside would have looked like, that building we visited, and she in her quote she describes it as being not unlike a dissenting chapel. I guess I don't know England well enough to know what your dissenting chapels are like, but this is pretty, as synagogues go, this is a pretty impressive one. She notices the gallery on all three sides. In Deronda, we have a couple of different synagogue visits. The Merritt girls go with Mira to a synagogue where they sit in the women's gallery, they sit apart from the men, and to them that's a bit weird. And that's something George Eliot would have, she would have had to sit there if she were going on synagogue visits. After this, they start they seem to be seeking out synagogues in their travels after this point. So by the time they get to Amsterdam in 1866, we looked about for the very Portuguese synagogue where Spinoza was assassinated. And so she claims there are no less than 3 Portuguese synagogues in Amsterdam. I think there is one Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam and several others, but which would have been more Ashkenazi than Sephardic. So there's a little bit of difference here. The one thing in Amsterdam that is sort of the Portuguese synagogue, that's what it's called, is this one. And it's so cool to have a painting so close to when she was there, showing what it would have looked like to go into a service there. And the reaction that the way they describe it sort of naively at this point, the chanting and the swaying about your bodies, almost wriggling, are not beautiful to the sense. But I faintly cried witnessing this faint symbolism of a religion of sublime far memories. That's pretty similar to the emotion that Deronda experiences the first time he goes in. There's things going on he doesn't understand, and yet there's there's something profound happening. There's something that's impressive. I think they'll have one more synagogue visit later on in Frankfurt, but each of the time in their travels they go to see synagogues. They write about it like that, as if they're spectators watching this event happen, and then they leave. They don't seem to talk to people in the congregation. And on their travels, they do write a lot about other people that they do talk to. So they'll have an anecdote about visiting a synagogue, and the next paragraph will be like, and then we had dinner with this interesting Irish family, and they will tell you, but they're not really. They're watching what's happening in the synagogue. They're not really engaging socially with the Jewish communities, and this. Ultimately, what this means is that a lot of her information about Judaism came from one guy, this guy, who was a Talmud at the British Museum, whom she hired to teach her Hebrew, starting in the 1860s. and they met weekly. That this is by far the closest kind of personal connection to a Jewish friend that she develops in her sort of more distant research and consulting. The last two study days were both about people in George Eliot's life who knew her, who influenced her, and the idea for this talk came from me saying, is anyone going to do a talk about this guy who had such an influence on her and is such an unusual part of her social world. I think depending on, this is an area, John, where depending on how much time we have, we could go more deep or less deep. He's born in Silesia. When Mordecai, when the character, basically he's the basis for Mordecai, and it's a very close life. He's dying of cancer for the last few years. George Eliot knows him, and dreaming of getting back to Palestine to die there, and he makes it part of the way back to Egypt. He's already been once. The British Museum sent him, and it was just a really emotional thing for him. It was incredible to be back. She deals several times in these works towards the end of her life with men who are geniuses, or who believe themselves to be geniuses, who want to produce some great work and are somehow thwarted in bringing that about. So after he was born in Germany, but when Mordecai describes his background, he says he's in Holland, and then he's been on the continent a bit, and there was an uncle who took charge of his education. He also had an uncle who was a great rabbinic scholar who took charge of him between the ages of 8 and 13 for his bar mitzvah, and it's a very intense study regimen. So winter and summer, he had to rise at 5 o'clock and study without fire or food for 1 hour or two, until the time of daily prayer had arrived, in which another hour was passed. And then the rest of the day until 8 p.m. was passed in close application to his books. But one goya is 1/4 of an hour being the only time allowed for recreation, and about the same for exercise and fresh air. He used to look back on these years with painful self-pity, although his attachment to his uncle was profound and tender, and his gratitude to him. And after this really intense education, to the bar mitzvah age, he goes to a more normal German high school where he's so ahead that you're supposed to spend 2 years in high school, and he's so ahead that after 6 months, the masters want to send him on to matriculation at university, and they're so sure that it's just a waste of keeping him there. They're fighting repeatedly with the authorities, petitioning until they get to send him on. And then he goes to university in Berlin, and then I guess this offer to come work for the British Museum. He's brilliant. He's very bright. But later in his life, when she's meeting him, there's this sense that he hasn't done as much as he was supposed to do. He writes a lot of articles for encyclopedias and things, and in 1867 he writes an article about the Talmud, sort of explaining Jewish law to a broader audience that gets him some notice from literary figures in London, but he's very sensitive to their criticism, and he's not, so in this he's a bit like Solomon, I guess, and sort of wanting to put out a great work and not quite getting it together. He's a bit like Mordecai, and there's a body of scholarship on how much his influence with her influenced Middlemarch, which we're not going to get into because this is in Deronda Day. But just, when Dorothea is fantasizing about marrying herself in the beginning and how great it's going to be, part of what she's imagining is having someone to teach her Hebrew, as if that's this, key to understanding all such interesting things in history. And George Eliot, at the time she wrote that, was taking Hebrew lessons from this man. And it's Dorothy's reaction to Casaubon at first is sort of like Deronda's reaction to Mordecai, where you see this kind of tortured, struggling genius, and you want to help facilitate the birth of their grandchild. It's sort of it's tender, it's sympathetic. By the time George Eliot gets to writing Theophrastus Such after Deronda, which is it's not a proper novel, it's a set of kind of character sketches, but she includes some characters kind of like that who are convinced that they're a genius in a way that the world hasn't recognized yet and can't really bring themselves to get it out. And she's much more critical. They come off much more like vulnerable narcissists or something who just can't, there's something interesting going on there. But it's he wants to produce great work. He's not able to do it. His health is failing towards the end of his life. He's dreaming of getting back to Palestine. Because they met in person so much, we don't have as great of letters, we don't have as great of a written record of exactly what he was telling her about what he believed about Palestine as we do for her friends. That she writes the Brazen Hells a lot because she's not with them all the time. There's one letter to him that's kind of captures the emotional quality of their relationship pretty well that has survived. Dear Mr. George, she writes, I cannot be easy without writing a word or two this morning, for I am conscious that I made myself more disagreeable than nature obliges me to be by my hard quips to you. They were not warrantable by anything but a strong personal and impersonal interest in that sensitive being in yours, which holds what may be very precious things in its keeping. This is sounding like Mordecai and Daniel to me. And even with that warrant, it will be a proof of your fondness if you quite forgive me. You look wretched, and I have now so much of that subtle misery which can be explained to nobody that I cannot help thinking of you as a sharer in that sort of suffering, since you tell me there is nothing more severally comprehensible as a moment of melancholy. The handwriting's a bit tricky there. We hungry, quick wincing creatures, who are always seeking our food with wounded tentacles, must simply accept life as a misfortune to our primary and direct self, and make up our minds that all our joy must come of working ourselves powerfully into the lives of other beings, or else giving ourselves up to be possessed by them. We may grumble and say that rosy and comfortable dejection is better than those sublime heights, but then we never shall be rosy and comfortable. Some good is to be got by weary struggle, and by that alone. That is not to tell you what you don't already know, O Rabbi, but it is simply the discourse of a fellow. This is apparently a Gulliver's Travels reference. I didn't know that when I was reading this. Who was very yoke with you. We tell each other that the day is fine, and that the northeast wind is biting. You need not answer if you have nothing to say, which is a rare privilege in this world. They're friends, they're kindred spirits. There's passages about his life in the British Museum where he's talking about how great it is to be spending time with all those treasures, and then to go home and be with his Schiller and his Zosa and his Zupe. You can see how it's not hard to see how these two would have vibed. They had not just a strong interest in religious topics, but also in the secular learning at the time. So this is a final synagogue visit after she's already given Hebrew lessons. When they go to Frankfurt, she's so insistent on visiting the synagogue that she makes them stay for 5 days to get to the time of the service. Like, they're so far from Schwannery by accident, they're planning to visit around that. And you can see that this is George Henry Lewis. He's not that into it. This is for Buddhist purposes. And it was terrifically hot and not interesting to us who had often been to Frankfurt. Daniel Deronda also goes to a synagogue in Frankfurt, and when he's asking directions, he wants the Orthodox synagogue, not the Reform synagogue. He expresses that preference without saying anything about why. And there's a big Reform movement happening in Frankfurt at the time, and there's also a sort of a split from Orthodoxy in the other direction of trying to be even more traditional about the forms of religion, and those groups will both end up opposing sort of Zionism. There's no word Zionism, but they'll both end up opposing the idea of return to Israel in different ways. The Reform arguments look a lot like what Gideon says in the book scene in Deronda. Wanting to integrate where they are and be seen as full citizens of the country they're in, and not to be seen as having divided loyalties, and feeling like you could just kind of remove the parts of the liturgy that make any sort of reference to prophecy about Zion. You could just take that out and keep going without it. This is Gideon's view. Whereas on the other side, Samson Hirsch was a big figure in Frankfurt, both very vocal and Zionist, for sort of the other reasons. He's sort of too religious, and it's in the sense that he doesn't. The prophecy is that the return to the Holy Land should happen at the time of the second coming and the last judgment of the third, not the second coming, but at the end of time. And choosing to do that early is man's will, not God's will. It's not the way this is supposed to be done. So there's there's lots of Jewish opposition to return to Israel, both now and then, that she's sort of glossing over. We get the Gideon character in the pub, and that's about it. Her vision of Judaism is really dominated by Deronda's vision of Judaism is really dominated by Mordecai, in the way that George Eliot's vision of Judaism is kind of dominated by the George character. So it's she writes the book, she publishes the book, and over, she gets a lot of appreciation from Jews at being seen and being represented, represented respectfully, sort of independent of the question of whether there should be a polity in Israel or not. It's the respect that really seems to matter to them, and their respect really matters a lot to her. So she, by this point in her writing career, she's gotten the habit of, you finish a major project, then you get out, you travel somewhere, you don't deal with the reviews until you get back. So they go away and they come back. We reached home only last night, so that we arrived as strangers and foreigners to all home affairs, the fortunes of DD included. We had scarcely taken our much-needed dinner before a parcel was brought in, which proved to be DD and the 4-bound volumes, and various letters with other missiles and inverted commas, as an acquaintance of mine once quite naively called his own favors to his correspondence, which have at present only gone to swell a heap that I need to make acquaintance with very slowly. Mr. Lewis, however, is more eager than I, and he has just brought up to me a letter which has certainly gratified me more than anything else of the sort I ever received. It is from Dr. Herman Adler, the chief rabbi here, expressing his warm appreciation of the fidelity with which some of the best traits of the Jewish character have been depicted by, etc., etc. And she says to her publisher, I think this will gratify you too. This is Herman Adler, the chief rabbi of England at the time. And there's one other, she gets a lot of response, a lot of positivity, a lot of negativity. This is a Jewish chronicle who wrote her something nice, to which she replied, nothing could have caused me to regret my work except the evidence that Jews of high character and culture felt my presentation to be unreal and unjust. I am indebted to you and also to Herman Adler, who we just saw, for the most authoritative assurance that I have no cause for regret. So it's on the one hand, it's obviously very nice and touching that she cares about their opinion, but the idea that nothing could have caused me to regret except the evidence that Jews of high character and culture feel as well is, what about the less elite, Jews having different opinions? What about the Palestinian Arabs and stuff? There are lots of opinions. She really values that side of approval, and that's good. But there are blind spots in the way she's researching this. And then she and her friend wrote about it. I've had some very interesting letters from both Jews and from Christians about Deronda. Part of the scene at the club, which is this conversation at the pub with Gideon that we've been discussing, is translated into Hebrew in a German Jewish newspaper. So in English, we've said that some English people cut out the Deronda parts and just have the Gwendolyn parts. There were also audiences that cut out the Gwendolyn parts and just have the Deronda parts. On the other hand, a Christian, highly accomplished, thanks me for embodying the principles by which Christ for often will conquer. This is better than the laudation of readers who cut the book up into scraps and talk of nothing but Gwendolyn. That's my type of nothing but Gwendolyn. I meant everything in the book to be related to everything else there. So even the Christians engaging, not the way she intended, are to her better than the ones who don't deal with the issue at all. That's a pretty strong statement. And then to end my thought about another kind of very commonly quoted thing around this novel is her correspondence with Harriet Beecher Stowe. So as Harriet Beecher Stowe is an American at this time, she's been writing Uncle Tom's.
Who is that?
That is Harriet Beecher Stowe. So she's an American writer who wanted to write about the African slave population with a similar kind of intent George Eliot had with the Jews in Deronda as something that would make them intelligible as humans to a literary public that's not thinking of them that way. So these two start corresponding, and it's, again, there's a lot of letters back and forth. It's some people writing about that correspondence say it's surprising that, you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe was this sort of strict religious woman, and that she would be engaging with George Eliot, who lived in sin with the man for 20 years. That's really overlooking what a sort of serious religious, in a way, person George Eliot, how seriously she took religion, how seriously she took morals. That's but they, and Harriet Beecher Stowe doesn't seem to mind. She's sending George Eliot pictures of her grandson. It's a very, you know, showing dynamic. And this is the letter about Deronda between them itself included, which is a fuller version. As to the Jewish element, this is George Eliot writing to Harriet. As to the Jewish element in Deronda, I expected from first to last in writing it that it would create much stronger resistance and even repulsion than it has actually met with. But precisely because I felt that the usual attitude of Christians towards Jews is, I hardly know whether to say more impious or more stupid when viewed in the light of their professed principles, I therefore felt urged to treat Jews with such sympathy and understanding as my nature and knowledge could attain to. Moreover, not only towards the Jews, but towards all Oriental peoples with whom we English come into contact, a spirit of arrogance and contemptuous dictatorialness is observable, which has become the national disgrace to us. There is nothing I should care more to do, if it were possible, than to rouse the imagination of men and women to a vision of human claims in those races of their fellow men who most differ from them in customs and beliefs. But towards the Hebrews, we Western people, who have been reared in Christianity, have a particular debt, and whether we acknowledge it or not, a peculiar thoroughness of fellowship in religious and moral sentiment. Can anything be more disgusting than to hear people called educated, making small jokes about eating ham, and showing themselves empty of any real knowledge as to the relation of their own social and religious life to the history of the people they think themselves wicked and insulting? They hardly know that Christ was a Jew. And I find men educated, supposing that Christ spoke Greek. To my feeling, this deadness to the history which has prepared half our world for us, this inability to find interest in any form of life that is not clad in the same coattails and flounces as our own, lies very close to the worst kind of irreligion. The best that can be said of it is that it is a sign of the intellectual narrowness, in plain English, the stupidity, which is still the average mark of our culture. And I mean, she's being really hard on England specifically there, but this is not just an English problem. This is a problem across many places at the time. Yes, I expected more aversion than I have found, but I was happily independent in material things and felt no temptation to accommodate my writing to any standard except that of trying to do my best in what seemed to me most needful to be done. And I sum up with the writer of the Book of Maccabees: if I have done well, and as befits the subject, it is what I desired. And if I have done ill, it is what I could attain unto. And I thought that observation I like as an ending point, because it shows George Eliot's personal growth from earlier in her career, which she's always a meticulous researcher, and she's always very worried about getting it right. But if you compare this process we just saw with what she went through writing Romola, when she decided to write this historical novel about Florence and the Renaissance period, she's so worried, she's so anxious, she's so dragging her feet, she's so dependent on George Lewis to tell her that it's going to be okay. And here, she's grown enough, she's had enough success that she can own it, she can decide what she wants to do and do it, and not care so much about the criticism. She's openly courting criticism. That's a nice end for a character arc. All right, got there?
Thank you very much, Laura. Are there any immediate questions? I mean, or shall we include them with the comments from
Just have one quick one.
John? Yes.
We know Deutsch was for Russian Silesia. Do we know what university he went to there? I assume it's Breslau.
No, he went to Berlin for university.
Oh, he went to Berlin.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Can I just make some comments to contextualise some of your talk? Is that all right? I mean, you mentioned Spinoza, that's wonderful really, because Spinoza was a sort of character who was undermining the authority of Scripture, that's why he got expelled. He was an embarrassment to the Jewish community. And his felon was because they couldn't tolerate him being part of the community, because it was offensive to all the Christians and to Jews in his thinking. She translated his ethics, by the way, and thank goodness now they've been published at long last, so that's wonderful. But what else she translated, of course, was David Friedrich Strauss's Das Leben Jesu and the Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, both of which are pretty radical texts. And it was Germany that was kind of the source of high criticism. This was what was going on in Germany. And from a Jewish point of view, I'm Jewish, but so to me it's really interesting that we have a Jewish Reformation in Germany. That's where Reformed Judaism started. At the time that she was visiting, which is really interesting, so she's very aware of Orthodox Judaism and Reformed Judaism. And also, very interestingly, the rabbis from both those sides have been trained in the same background, because they'd all come from the same background, but their paths had diverged. It's very interesting that she had read Abraham Geiger, for example. That's really interesting, because Jews were coming around to the thought of reclaiming the historical Jesus back into Judaism. That's what Geiger was up. That was his mission. So I just wanted to kind of contextualise that, and that's why Spinoza is significant, her connection with Spinoza. And Emanuel Deutsch, I mean, he was amazing, really. He was the Times correspondent to the Vatican as well. I don't know whether anybody knows that. And he published an article in the Quarterly Review on the Talmud, and it was the first time that anybody had had any contact with the Talmud. And it was published in various editions, and it was republished, you know. So he was very significant. That's probably, I'm trying to think of how she would have met him, and maybe that's because she was the editor of the Westminster Review. I think she might have met him through that.
Well, there are different accounts of this. The Quarterly Review article comes out in 1867. Some people, he gets a lot of attention for that. A lot of people who didn't know him before are writing after that, and some people seem to guess that she might have been one of those people, but then other sources say no, they met before, and he gave her an advance copy of the article that the religion was already in place. And the best guess there is that they would have been at the British Museum or the British Library while she was doing research. But there's some doubt around that.
Any other comments? Right, well, it's been fascinating, Laura, and it's been a wonderful morning, actually. It really has. Terrific. Thank you so much for your contribution to it. And there's so much I just simply didn't know about, which I want to find out more. Really interesting. We're sort of on track, really. We've got about an hour or so for lunch, which hopefully will be next door, and the rest of the building, as you know, is now open and available for us. The learning group has gone off, and we've got the building to ourselves. So thank you all for your attendance so far and for your interest. It's been a really successful, interesting morning, and thank you to our two speakers who have made that possible.
May I just say, because I won't be here this afternoon, I hope you've all seen the paper about the trip to Elliston in July. It's going to be absolutely fascinating. Sorry? Elliston, Adam Reed Country, Hayslop. It's going to be really wonderful, so do come and join us.
And tickets are booking quite well for that, which is good. Right, enjoy your lunch break.